All right. Welcome, everyone, to the May IGRI Research Seminar. Thank you for coming, especially for what is a busy time, particularly in the academic year. So thank you for taking the time to come here and to hear this month's presenter, who is Diego Macall. So I'll introduce him briefly, and then I will yield to him for him to give his presentation. So Diego Macall is a researcher at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. He is also the Secretary General of the International Consortium on Applied Bioeconomy Research. His research interests include agricultural biotechnology, agricultural systems modeling and simulation, sustainability, and urban agriculture. And his presentation today is entitled Barcelona's Municipal Food System Characterization and Analysis with the Institutional Grammar Tool. So, Diego, floor is yours. Oh, you are still muted, Diego.
I apologize for that. Okay, I'm just going to set up my slides here, and if you'll just let me know that we're good and you can all see them, then I'll start my presentation.
Yeah, I can see him.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be able to talk to you today. I want to thank Davor for being so kind and generous with his time and very understanding. So when he presented me with the opportunity to be able to present here, I jumped at that because I did want to talk to all of you and hopefully get some feedback on what I'm trying to do or what we're trying to do. I do want to begin by saying that at the time that I wrote, at the time I wrote Davor, I did change a little bit because the research has obviously progressed. I was just beginning my incursion into this area. So as time has gone on, as the weeks have gone on, I've been changing a little bit my research approach. And so the working title now is The Scaling Up of Rooftop Greenhouse Production in Barcelona, Institutional Identification and Analysis. So I first want to start by giving a little background and introduction into the general issue. So we all know that modern agriculture has been around for about, or at least the industrial model has been around for about 80 years, what came after World War II. And so, but in the last 50 years, we've seen that an approximate increase of 1 degree in global temperatures has decreased total factor productivity by 21% worldwide. And so that has huge ramifications for agriculture. And added to this, well, in spite of this, agriculture was already facing some very serious abiotic constraints. So dwindling amount of arable land, increasing water and phosphorus scarcity, and an increasing number of protein-based diets worldwide. And the reason that is important is because the expansion of the agricultural frontier for a certain number of feed crops is cutting into the food security of certain nations. So it's becoming clear that we need innovation in the agricultural space. But the question is, where does one begin, or where do we begin? Wensing and all argue that food system transformation should be initiated in cities. And their argument rests on the observation that most food processing, distribution, and the disposal of waste occurs in cities. Why not also have transformations be initiated from them? And in a little bit about history of cities also, Jacobs in a book talks about how cities have historically been the source or the epicenter of agricultural transformation, because that's where the R&D components of agricultural or food systems occurs. Why not have them initiate there? But there are also other reasons as to why cities could be viewed as the place where agricultural transformations could now occur. And that's for the simple reason that in just 25 years, 68% of humans will be living in an urban area. And it's very likely that for the remainder of the 21st century, most human activity will take place in cities. So why not agriculture? Municipal governments and regional governments around the world are actively devising and enacting their agricultural and food policies because they have taken notice of this trend. And I have to say that historically, in many cities in the US, in the state of Pennsylvania and New England, they have historically had, their municipalities have historically had an office or a secretariat that deals with issues of food policies or agricultural policies or urban agriculture, as I'm about to explain a little bit, within their political boundaries. So this isn't really so much of a new phenomenon as one might think. The government of Catalonia, where I am located or based out of, has in Barcelona, has also taken notice of this, and in its push towards food sovereignty, has made it a policy goal to achieve 50% of food self-sufficiency by 2030. So in just a mere 6 years, they hope to expand the production of food by 50%, and that's going to take a lot of innovation and a lot of innovation in all aspects of food of the food systems. So in a previous study that is kind of the lead into this one, I used a linear programming model to allocate rooftop greenhouse area to rooftop greenhouse production, which I'll explain in a second. And that way, we posit that we could achieve a high degree of food self-sufficiency for certain food products, the ones that are more amenable to the production within a greenhouse. Now, urban horticulture is a form of urban agriculture, and I will confess that on its face, on first inspection, the concept of urban agriculture being scaled up to the level of a city it sounds a bit silly until one truly understands that most human activity takes place now within cities, the fact that the pressures on the agricultural systems around the world are getting more intense. And so it does seem like we need fundamental paradigm shifts in the way we think about agriculture, the way we think about food, and the way we think about nourishing ourselves. And so in that sense, the question guiding our work right now is more or less what formal policies would influence positively or negatively the scaling up of urban horticulture in Barcelona. Now, utilizing the institutional grammar tool, we hope to, first, we want to identify institutions that are relevant to its scale up, and then we hope the institutional grammar tool can give us better insight into how the practice of urban horticulture within Barcelona's political boundaries would be influenced. So I want to first give a little bit of background into Barcelona, and I'm talking about the city, not the province. So this is Barcelona. The city spans over 101 square kilometers. It is both politically, there's a boundary. It's got its political boundaries, but it's also got physical barriers that limit the expansion of the city. So to the north and to the south, it's bordered by 2 rivers. To the west, it's bordered by the Collserola mountain range. And to the east, it's the Mediterranean Sea or the Balearic Sea. Now, if you notice, the city is designed in such a way, and it was designed by Cerdà, if you are familiar with the architect, at the beginning of in the 1800s. It's designed in such a way that the most imposing figure of the city is the Sagrada Familia, which is a beautiful structure in the middle of the city. But if you notice, the rooftops of the city are flat, and at least 437 buildings of the more than 50,000 structures that are within the city are amenable to the installation of greenhouse structures. Now, within these greenhouse structures, what in the previous paper of our work, what we're positing is that you could install greenhouses that could be, to a certain extent, integrated into the infrastructure of existing buildings. And in these structures, as we see here at the top, we could produce certain crops. And we show that at least 1/3 of the tomato consumption of the cities, which on an annual basis is about 28,000 tons, about 1/3 of that could be produced within a very small amount of area, equivalent to about 1% of the city. 1/3 of those tons could be produced within Barcelona, which is quite remarkable. So that could be a significant innovation in these agricultural, or in Barcelona's food system, that could greatly contribute to the food self-sufficiency goals that the government has laid out for itself. But of course, it's not so simple as just importing that structure and implementing into it. There might be institutional arrangements or institutions that could serve as a stop, or it could allow or stop the expansion or scaling up of this practice. And so Crawford and Ostrom's institutional grammar tool offer us a structured approach to examine those formal and informal rules that govern the scaling up of urban horticulture within Barcelona. And so before I go into what we actually did, I just do want to say that when we observe a city or a food system, we necessarily do so on a limited range of scales because nobody is a expert in everything, right? We all have our domains of work. And so that limits our perceptions of both of these complex systems and necessarily into a low dimensional picture of a very high dimensional cake. What the institutional grammar tool, if I've understood correctly, could offer us is greater insight. And that's what we're hoping to get by its application into the institutions that govern whether or not we can embed the urban horticultural system into the city. Now, luckily, literature has many studies that have worked on food systems previously, which we've been able to observe. And this is a curiosity that I do have because there doesn't seem to be a standard number of institutional statements identified. So it does seem as though the study, once you lay out your research question, that more or less says what the number of institutions you're going to look at, and from that, the number of institutional statements you're going to be able to derive. So, for example, in Spain, in a very recent study, we have Perez Ibarra. They were studying the temporal changes in crop livestock systems in semi-arid Spain. And so the way they extracted their statements was through farmer interviews, and they identified 334 statements. In an analysis in the US, there was a coding of the policy instruments of organic food regulations. And in the Carter et al. 2016 study, they identified 929 institutional statements. Espinoza in Mexico did so in a study looking at tobacco regulations. They were more analyzing formal law, institutional statements, and they only came away with 30. Garcia Lozano looked at, in a study in Costa Rica, the implementation of fishery policies, and they came away with 357 institutional statements. The types were formal and informal, so that's a novelty for us, that, well, at least particularly for me, that I'm learning the tool, that you can combine these studies and you get a better picture. And of course, Siddiqui et al. In 2010 looked at the Colorado state aquaculture system by coding law and semi-structured interviews, and they identified 346 institutional statements. The reason I keep make emphasis on the institutional statements is because so far, as I'm about to show, we've identified 37 statements. And so I don't know that there's a actual number. I think it's just based on the institutions that we identify. And then once we make the cutoff, that'll be the number of institutional statements that we analyze. And so before I actually show what we've done so far, I do want to say that we are aware that, for example, Dunlop's not critique, but observation that if a hypothesis is not explicitly expounded, the IGT tends to skew towards an exercise in description. And we'd like to move a little bit beyond that and not just describe what's going on or what institutions govern the IGT or the Barcelona scaling up of urban horticulture in Barcelona, but also try to get a picture of what these institutions are telling us and whether we can do them or whether we can move such a system into the city or not. Now, so far, and I do have to make a caveat here, Dr. Villamayor has been very kind and very patient with me on walking me through the IGT. And I really do mean this. Any mistakes you might see in my approach right now are mine and mine alone. So I've been trying to approach the issue by applying the first version of the institutional grammar tool. And so right now I can only present preliminary results. And the reason I mention this is because, of course, Dr. Siddiqui has upgraded the IGT, and her colleagues, they've made an amendment to it, and that is the tool we are trying to work ourselves towards. But first, we wanted to make an approach to the first institution that we've identified with the basic IGT version that Crawford and Ostrom posited in 1995. And so the first instrument that we've identified is the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which has 37 recommended actions clustered into 6 categories. And this is a pact that, among other things, says that a city who is signatory to this instrument is going to foster the production of food within its geographical boundaries, from its political boundaries. And of course, Barcelona is signatory to this. Now, before I show the radar chart we have for it, I do want to say that since this is a voluntary arrangement, or at least we could not find any or else component to it. And so I just wanted to show that we are working ourselves through the coding process. And we're obviously I'm doing it by hand. First, because I really need to learn how it's done, the nitty-gritty, so to speak. But also because before we move on to softwares that we've seen out there, I really would like to get a deeper understanding of the logic of the coding process. It is slow, but once an instrument is done, it is rewarding to see that there is a breakdown of the institutional statement. With that in mind, I can only show right now like a bird's eye view of this Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. And of course, as I mentioned, since we have not identified it nor else, I did think about the best way to represent the data that we have so far. And as you can see, the 37 institutional statements that we identified for this document, they obviously, all institutional statements have an attribute, less so a deontic or an aim, and the conditions for their activation or under which they become relevant are also reduced in number. And so, yeah, this is a question I have more or less for all of you, the experts. If depending on the type of document or policy instrument, if that's a normal thing. Well, in this case, given that it's a voluntary document, I would expect no or else component to any institutional statement found, or if there was any, they would be reduced in number. Now, well, I want to say that was the municipal government's commitment or reaffirmation to the expansion of an urban agricultural system, and among which, of course, is the production of food within the city. But something else going back to the city is that if you notice within the city, it's not as though space is abundant. Barcelona, as beautiful as a city as it is limited in space. And so the next instrument that we have identified is the zoning laws, which will very much dictate to us. Okay, I want to be cautious about that word, especially with governance experts. That will, I think, very much instruct us as to whether we can implement productive infrastructure into the city. So it's one thing that authorities voluntarily say that they would like to produce food within the city. It's another thing whether current regulations or zoning laws do actually allow it. And if we were to find a clash between both, at this point in time, I'm not entirely sure how would we approach that. So that's just a caveat of that. So that will be the next issue that the next instrument that we are trying to code. But I have to also make another caveat in that the documents are in Catalan. And Catalan is, if any of you are aware of that language, it's about a mix between Spanish and French. And so the reason I say this is because from Catalan, we will translate this into English and then apply the IGT to the translation. And that's something else that I haven't really found in other studies as to how they approach that issue. So I've seen it from Spanish, but I haven't seen it from languages such as Catalan. And so as I was explaining, we're going to do that to the Barcelona zoning laws. And at this point, I really don't have any concluding remarks. I can only summarize what we've done so far, in that we're beginning to apply identified institutions that are relevant to the scale-up of urban horticulture in Barcelona. We are trying to apply the IGT only to formal policy documents. We will not be looking at any informal institutions. We think that the IGT can help us better understand the institutions relevant to the movement of the productive component of a food system into a city. And yeah, for the time being, it's really what I had to say. And I very much look forward to your suggestions more than your questions, but of course I'm open to questions. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Diego, for your presentation. Then we will move to questions. I see Uta has her hand raised, so go ahead. Like instantaneous.
Thank you, Devor, and thank you, Diego, for that presentation. It was really interesting, and I I understand and I hear your struggles with the IG. It's the same way for anybody who ventures into this, but I did want to let you know that I think that your work is really important. My second hat is in local governance, and one of the things that we struggle with at the local level, as you probably know, is net zero policies. And we need to start thinking about our agriculture on a more local level. And so I think this work is really important from that perspective. With regard to, so I just wanted to comment on that. And I also think it's really important to start moving a little bit away from the descriptive to a more standardized computational analysis of the spreadsheet, because there's only so much, as I like to say, there's only so much eyeballing of a spreadsheet that you can do, and there might be other insights to gain from other analysis. But yes, the hands-on coding definitely is useful when you're getting started. With regard to, I have a comment on the coding. You might find the IG2 actually easier than the IG1. Just a suggestion, because it is a little bit more structured than the IG 1.0, and I say that having coded in both. But again, that's my personal observation. And I like that you highlight that there is no standardization for how many institutional statements per document. So that is something that really isn't standardized. And generally what I did in my work is kind of look at the total sum of institutional statements and then just take a percentage and say, this is the percentage of statements that were analyzed out of all the texts that we found. So that's one way on that. I did want to ask you about the aims. You said you found statements without aims. And I was wondering if you could, respond to that. And other than that, I think it's really great work, and sorry for talking so much.
Not at all. Thank you so much for that wonderful comment. Thank you. That's definitely a confidence booster needed at this point, because it does seem it is a daunting task to learn a methodology and then try to go and apply it. So yeah, thank you so very much for that. Yes, so as for the aims, yeah, I did read I did, of course, go through other studies and try to figure out. I've watched a lot of the webinars the IGRI research seminar series has hosted. And of course, by comparison, you shouldn't compare your first page to a finished book, of course. But yeah, it seems like there are different ways to approach that. And so that's something that I'm not entirely sure about. For example, the number of institutional statements that are extracted, that is definitely something that I would love to hear more about. If you all have any more comments, that different studies will have a different set of institutional statements, and then they'll make obviously concluding remarks based on that. So that was interesting. As for the aims, specifically, you asked me, yes. So it was because I think it's a voluntary institutional policy instrument. So certain institutional statements, at least perhaps on first inspection, we didn't identify an aim. And perhaps you're already highlighting a shortcoming we might have. And I will definitely take another look. At this point, I've looked at that spreadsheet that I showed you of 37 institutional statement at least 3 times completely. And then Dr. Villamayor, of course, he's can't go through every single statement for me, but he's highlighted mistakes each time. Not mistakes, but definitely things where we differ in how we approached the coding. And so that's something that I'm also, given that it's the first experience I have with this tool or the methodology, I'm not as confident at this point in. So I would like to say that.
I would say there
Yeah.
should be an aim because it's part
Okay.
of the core components of the IG. So there should always be an aim in a statement, unless you're looking at a constitutive statement. So that's another thing, right? And even in a constitutive statement, you would be expecting to see a function, so which is the equivalent there. So and maybe you have an example statement or something that you
Oh,
can share just to say
yeah,
where as an example statement where there isn't an aim, because that might
sure.
also be helpful. Sorry, and
No, no
I'm
worries at all.
realizing that Graham's hand is open too. And I also wanted to say that it's not uncommon to not have or else's in statements.
Okay. Yes, there doesn't
Uh,
seem to be a statement that would inhibit, say, not inhibit, but it serves as a deterrent, so to speak. Maybe somebody else can ask a question while I try to dig up my my Excel sheet here. Sorry.
Graham, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to start off by saying really cool work as a fellow undergrad agronomy person. I'm excited to see another agronomist here, so very cool. Um, I guess so. From my work with the Law and Urban Food Policy Pact, right? So this is like largely a hortatory tool, right? It's a voluntary sign-on, as you mentioned. Um, but it's my understanding that it's one of the aims of the governance track that they are supposed to be doing like downstream food action planning, right? So I guess my question for you is it profitable to be coding the pact itself, or is it profitable to be coding like what is the policy changes or the programmatic changes that are occurring as a downstream effect of the city on the national scale signing on to the pact itself, right? Because I think that that is where you might end up finding, um, as you're alluding to, right? Like how are they changing their code, allowing or disallowing the rooftop greenhouses. So I know this is just like a starting step, but I'm curious if you can find kind of like these intermediary, like more specific policies or programs that are changing, that are directly affecting the behavior of the people in the city.
Okay. Thank you so much for that comment. And before I go back to Ute's question or yeah, Excel notice. So if I understood correctly, you're asking me if it's profitable or beneficial to approach that. At this start with the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, if I understood correctly, Graham. Yeah. Okay. So the answer is I don't know, because this is the first document that I actually ventured to do it by myself before I even talked to Dr. Villamayor. And that doesn't mean that's the correct way to do it. It just means that I had to start somewhere. And I said, okay, well, you know, I'm have to get practice. There's no way, given how complicated it seems at first, daunting it seems at first to use this methodology, that I will get it right. There's just no way. So I said, okay, this seems like a straightforward document. I can read it. I think I can identify its components and apply the IGT to it. And then I will start from there. And then that way I did have something to go talk to Dr. Villamayor with, right? That's, to be honest with you, that's the reason I started there. But you may be right that as I read more into the tool, I read more papers, and then I start comparing to what's out there, then perhaps, yeah, it might change. I may entirely drop this, you know, I really don't know. But the reason to start there was because, as Ute was saying, the municipalities are taking a little bit more seriously their food production within their cities to try to see if they can attain a certain level of food self-sufficiency. Of course, cities have innumerable competing demands, right? Well, there's many things we need. Energy, we need green areas for well-being and all that stuff. So I at the very least, I would like to show, hopefully, the municipality that this is an option, right? And by showing them that the commitments they've made could lead to, you know, the production of food within the city. So that's more or less kind of my approach. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. I guess my advice would be just right, because like Uda was saying, you don't have the or else's, you don't have like these really specific tasks. So I'm not saying that the IG on the pact is not profitable. I don't want you to think that, but rather I think the main tool or mechanism of the pact is that it's essentially the mayors or the city council or whoever it is, the city is signing on to like the international stage to say we are identifying ourselves as caring about the local food system, right? But these cities then are having specific food policy plans as an outcome of signing on to the pact. And then in that plan, it might say, we require that the planning department reevaluates the structural requirements for putting greenhouse structures on buildings, right? So like that would be the very, very specific policy statement downstream of the pact itself would help you do the modeling, do the ABM, or do the kind of numerous downstream kind of analyses that you could do once you have the IG coded itself. So I'm not saying it's not profitable, but I think as you kind of go down the stream, you get closer to these specific IG statements that are really changing the behavior of citizens and municipal folks, bureaucrats, whatever, at the Barcelona level.
Thank you so much. And you're right. At this point in time, the Milan Pact is more or less a set of goals to be achieved. It doesn't actually specify how to get there, right? And you're right. I would expect that if the municipality takes it more serious, it's not, I shouldn't say that. Once you actually start reading about municipalities, you find out that there are very limited resources, and I mean in literally across the spectrum, right? People, time, financial resources, those are always going to be in scarcity. And so if they at some point have more resources to be able to devote this, then yeah, you're right. They would have to come up with their own plan. And I think this would serve as the basis, not necessarily the end. So yeah, but thank you so much. There's really helpful comments. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Maybe I can share my screen again. This is, can you all see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Oh, I'm muted. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, so I actually wanted to go back and show you one of the first attempts I made at this. And as you can see, I was not able to parse it out as I think you should. And so in the aim, I've got many things, which I don't think is correct. And so that's how I started approaching this. So I would literally have well, I can show you all now. I have the paper. I don't know, can you see it? Because I don't know, my screen's a little blurry. But this is the paper, right? This is Ostrom, and you can see all my scribbling on it. That's the paper. I would have this open on my desk and then start looking at the institutional statement of the Milan Urban Policy Pact, and then have the spreadsheet open. And that's how I'm approaching it. So very, very low tech, probably not as advanced as all of you might be able to now do with all the practice, right? So that's how I'm approaching it the first time around. And so that's where I'm having issues actually parsing these statements out. And I don't know if I could show you anything specific, or you'd be interested in seeing anything specific. Yeah, for example, okay, I will comment one thing that this pact, for example, overarchingly says municipal authorities, right? And so I'm just assuming that that's the attribute, municipal authorities, and that the ontic is to improve, for example, in this statement, right? And then improve waste management and the reuse in agricultural food production, which is the aim. And that's more or less where it, I think, would end. or I don't know if actually, nope, I did. Execution constraint, participatory approaches. At least that's the way I coded it. I'm not saying that this is correct. So this is one of the first attempts where Dr. Villamayor hasn't actually given too much of his comments yet. He's only looked at it cursory, right? So I don't know if anybody had a comment or question here. Maybe I have a question for all of you. Yeah, so it's actually about the interpretation of results. Once you have all the institutional statements broken down and you're very confident, and perhaps other colleagues have looked at the coding, how do you go about interpreting the results? For example, Ute?
Thank you for sharing this. This is really insightful, and interpreting the results, it depends on your research question. It depends on what you find. But before you can even get there, I think there are some modifications that you might want to consider doing to your coding. And I realize and I appreciate so much what you're doing, because I was out there struggling all by myself as well. So I know how difficult it can be to read the literature on the IG and actually applying it. One of the things that I think may be helpful for you is to think about this. First of all, I wanted to piggyback back on what Graham said, because I do think there is some value in looking at aspirational documents themselves, because they give you an idea of what the overarching goals are. If you think about your research question in terms of action situation, what are the important action situations? So decision-making context that you want to look at, that might provide you guidance with a selection of institutional statements that will help you populate what that action situation looks like from a goals perspective and from an implementation perspective in different documents. So for example, in my own research, I was interested in monitoring and enforcement. So I had 40 documents, but I didn't code all 40 documents. I pulled out the statements that had to do with implementation, with the monitoring and enforcement aspects of this particular policy.
May I ask you a question
Yeah,
there?
yeah.
That is actually very crucial. Thank you so much. So you just said something that was very insightful that I also didn't have an answer to when looking at other papers. So you can, I forgive my language. Do you selectively apply the IGT to the institutional statements that you think are relevant to your research question? Or do you apply it systematically to all statements in a policy document?
I did both. So for my
Okay.
PhD dissertation, I coded everything. I
Okay.
don't do that anymore because it's very time consuming. And it's perfectly okay to say, I am looking at this particular context and I'm pulling out these statements. And when you publish, you want to show your coded statements, include them with your as a supplementary material, and then people can go look and see what you coded. And if they have any disagreements and think you missed something, then there's another paper potentially. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we need to be engaging in, which is why I really appreciate you presenting your work here today. So yeah, but looking at this coding, these statements do have aims. Aims are usually the verb in a sentence. It's just
Okay.
sometimes just one word, like we want to improve, so improve would be your aim.
Right.
And
Okay.
deontics, you need to look to the legal scholars. Deontics are
Okay.
shall, must, should. Sometimes if it is like a guide, it can be a can, but usually those get translated into may. So there's a whole structure, and the legal scholars are really the place where you want to go, because they've probably looked at this, they've drafted this. So when you see a shall or a must or a may, it really has a significant, and that's what you want to code as a deontic. And they're not always there. So that I'm not saying that you did anything wrong there, but the aims are also just sometimes just one verb. And I'm going to shut up because Saba probably has something really insightful to say.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate your work.
Well, yeah, no, very few people offer more insightful comments than Uta. I should just say that she's always so incredibly thoughtful. But I guess, Diego, I'm really glad you shared your coding sheet because it explains a lot of the puzzles that you're encountering. So it looks like some of that might be mischaracterized. So I think I can see why the intuition behind the coding that's there. It looked a lot actually like my initial coding when I was just using the Crawford and Ostrom piece, because the object was often lumped together with the description of the aim. And so I see that that's together in your coding. I think that referencing the IG1, but particularly the IG2 guidance will be helpful, just to kind of give you a sense of, what goes where and such. Then happy to meet with you separately to go over the coding.
Thank you.
But I think that I would code those statements differently. And so based on a recoding, you may find, you will find very different results.
So I am taking notes. Thank you so much. I do want to say I went actually back and showed you all a coding that was, I think this was like the second one I did. And the reason I did that was because I wanted you to see where I was. And I rather that happen because I would like to learn how to actually do it as best as I can. And I think, yeah, so I'm having a bit of a tough time trying to break this down. So that
Yeah,
is very helpful. Thank you so much for comments.
Yeah, I would advise you to maybe take a look at the IG2 code book.
Okay.
That gives several examples, but also a lot of specific guidance on how to go about the coding. I do still think, given, Graham's comments and Uta's comments, you'll still find that, there may not be as many deontics here because of the nature of the document. It could be that you don't have as much specific guidance regarding operational activities because of the nature of the document, et cetera. But otherwise, I think your results will be quite a bit different once you recode the information. To your question about, like, is it okay to code a subset of the statements? Absolutely. I mean, as
Okay.
part of your institutional sampling, if you will, you really want to just code the set of institutions that are most proximately linked to whatever it is that you're trying to explain. So, that could be that, you're only coding a particular set of institutions. That could be you're only coding a part of an institutional document, like a policy document, for example, and that's totally fine. All of that is kind of driven by what fundamentally is your research question. What are you trying to, which institutional phenomenon are you really interested in examining? In your case, it could be that you really want to code the whole document and then look at how different municipalities are operationalizing this document through their own sets of policies later on, or, what it means for decision making by particular actors, whatever. But scoping your institutional, like selection of institutions, is fundamentally a research question driven exercise.
I did want to ask one last question to take advantage before Graham also think it has a comment. Have all of you or any of you ever run into translations? And if so, how do you do that from one language to another? And obviously, everything is written has to be translated into English, right? But these documents does not have to translate it. Ute, I think, is signifying. Okay, that's interesting. That's very interesting.
Saba, you're muted.
Excuse me. I'm glad you brought that up because that was something that I wanted to respond to as well, based on what you had said in your presentation. So I would say the key thing to consider is what qualitative differences do you expect to see, given what you know about the difference in the syntactic structure of different languages, as well as cultural kind of norms about the use of particular terminology, et cetera. So, right, so it could be that certain languages just follow a different syntactic structure. So that means that, because in some ways, even though the institutional grammar is not a linguistic grammar, it isn't institutional grammar, because it has a certain grammatical pattern. It may be more or less suited to particular languages than others. But in addition to that, like those qualitative differences in syntactic structure across languages that might show up in your coding, there could be that there are cultural differences. So we've encountered, instances where there's an overabundance of particular deontics or an underabundance, a clear omission of particular kind of deontics. And we realized talking to, colleagues from those different countries, that that's not necessarily a deliberate choice. That's just a cultural norm that you don't use particular deontics as regularly as others or whatever. So being aware of some of the cultural differences, as well as that might be expressed in language, as well as fundamental differences in syntactic structure, will clue you into the applicability, as well as how to qualify the applicability based on those things. Does that make sense, Diego?
Yes, yeah, it really does. Thank you so much, because being a Latin-based language, it's slightly different, and there are certain translations that you make best case or closest word to, not necessarily there's an actual literal translation. So yes, I will keep that in mind. Thank you.
And it's interesting. Sorry, Graham, I know you have your hand up. We were just talking, these same colleagues from Zaragoza that I was mentioning, Nacho and Ismail, we were actually having a conversation about this recently, which is, in those instances, really capturing the semantics become really important rather than always the literal translation. So it's really like, you want to make sure that in the coding that you're doing, you're really capturing the meaning that, might get lost in translation fundamentally. So as I know that has some, implications for reliability, but it may be that your coding is more valid.
I will keep that in mind. Thank you.
Graham, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up quickly. Diego, I sent you a message.
I saw that. Thank you.
Yeah, so that most of these cities, after signing on to the Milan Urban Food Pact, are creating like a food charter or a food action plan. I mean, they're calling them different things, but they're functionally the same. So that link has a bunch of documents from Barcelona since signing on to the Milan Pact. And
Thank you.
last one is their food charter, which is, just from the quote, a strategic coordination tool for the development of food policies in the Barcelona metropolitan area. So this might give you the rules that are more proximal to the municipal decision making. But as like a polycentricity multiple levels thing, it might be interesting to look at how the pact is structuring these strategies, norms, and rules, and how individual signatories are structuring their specific rules within their charters or action plans. So I'm not trying to suggest that the pact analysis is not interesting. I think it could still be, but if you're interested in these kind of direct outcomes, the specific charter for Barcelona might be more kind of profitable in that sense.
Thank you. And as I said, I am grateful to all of you, and I really wanted to, I'm sorry this turned out to be more of me asking all of you questions than a presentation per se, but I knew that I'd rather ask you all questions because it's not that I was lost. Dr. Villamayor is guiding me as best as he can, but he can only take me so far because he's not applying it constantly. And so I knew I needed to talk to people that actually are more knowledgeable about this. So thank you so very much for all your helpful comments. And just Graham, no, you're absolutely correct. I think it may turn out to be that this was just a way to start practicing the tool for me. And then I might, later on think with Dr. Villamayor, perhaps this isn't the way to go. Maybe we drop this document and the research question becomes a little bit more clear as time goes on. But for the time being, this is how we started. So I started. So yeah, thank you.
And I've done some work on the Milan Pact as well as the food action planning stuff. So if you're interested in chatting over email, I'm happy to kind of pass off the stuff that I've learned in that process.
I very much am. So thank you so much for that availability. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Diego, I would say just some friendly advice. I think I would not make any conclusions about the appropriateness of this particular policy for your research exercise until you've recoded it.
Okay.
Because I do think your coding following these updated protocols will be quite a bit different. And so you'll draw very different kind of insights and be able to see, okay, what I think better be able to assess what types of data points are coming out of an application of the IG and whether or not that's suited to your broader research objectives. So I might suggest, just spending some time with that code book, recoding. The advantage is that you actually don't have that many statements, which I'm sure at this stage 37 feels like a million. Might as well. But I think that you will find, actually, to Uta's point, that with the updating coding protocols, the coding will actually be easier, and will give you a clearer sense of what's there and what's the particular value added of using the IG.
Thank you.
Any
Yeah, and
other questions? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add that there's no apologies necessary. The seminars are intended for just this very thing. That's what they're here for, and we all learn from each other. So
Thank
there's
you.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Any other questions or comments for Diego? All right. On that note, we will wrap up this month's seminar. Thank you, Diego, for coming and sharing your work. And thank you to everyone for coming and for your comments and questions. And we'll see you all next month.
Thank you all so very much for this. Thank you.
Thank
Really do
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Diego.
Bye-bye. Take
Thanks,
care.
Devor,
Cheers.
for organizing. Bye.
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 Bye.